It started with a simple moment, a quiet suspicion I didn't want to believe. Brianna and I had been married for 15 years, and if you had asked me even a month ago, I would have sworn she was my soulmate. Our life together wasn't flashy, but it was solid. We had 2 kids, Emily and Connor, both under 10, and they were my world. Brianna had a way of making the mundane feel meaningful. Or at least she used to. Something had shifted recently. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there were signs, subtle ones. Her laughter when we were alone didn't sound the same, as if she wasn't fully present. She was working late more often, claiming new responsibilities at the firm where she worked as a legal assistant. It didn't help that her boss, Patrick Coleman, was the type of man who exuded power and charm. The kind of guy you'd trust instinctively, but would regret later. I brushed off my discomfort as paranoia. She'd always been a loving mother and wife. We had plans, shared dreams, and she was attentive in ways that made my doubts feel petty. But then I stumbled upon something that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening. I had just finished a long day at work. Sitting at the dining table, I reached for the laptop we shared, hoping to check an email I'd forgotten to send earlier. That's when I noticed her work phone sitting beside it, screen lit up with a text message. Normally, I wouldn't have looked, but the sender's name caught my attention, Patrick Coleman. The preview of the message read, "I can't stop thinking about last night. Same time next week." The air felt like it had been punched from my lungs. My first instinct was denial. There had to be a reasonable explanation. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling, and unlocked it. She had never hidden her passwords from me, which made the discovery feel like a betrayal in itself. What I found wasn't a single message or misunderstanding. There were dozens of texts, photos of them together at company events, seemingly innocent until viewed through the lens of suspicion. Messages late at night, inside jokes I'd never heard, confessions of longing, and plans for meetings that weren't about work. It became clear this wasn't a fling. It was something much deeper, something long-standing. I sat there, frozen, staring at the damning evidence. My mind churned. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't I seen it sooner? And worst of all, what did this mean for Emily and Connor? I didn't confront her that night. I couldn't. Instead, I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it and poured myself a drink. I needed time to think, to plan. This wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about my family, my future, and protecting what little remained of the life I thought we had built together. As I stared into the amber depths of my whiskey glass, one thing became clear. Whatever was coming next, I had to be ready. Brianna had made her choices, but it was time for me to make mine. The days that followed were a haze of quiet observation and growing resolve. I couldn't let my emotions take over. I had to think rationally, even as every fiber of my being screamed to confront her. If what I suspected was true, I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof. And I needed a plan. That weekend, I acted as though everything was normal. I played with Emily and Connor in the backyard, grilled burgers for dinner, and laughed at Brianna's anecdotes about her busy week at work. The sheer audacity of her deceit made my skin crawl, but I masked it. If she noticed anything off about me, she didn't let on. I spent that Sunday setting up the groundwork. First, I ordered a small, high-definition camera disguised as a USB charger. It wasn't the sort of thing I ever thought I'd use, but desperate times called for desperate measures. It would fit perfectly into the living room, where she often worked late into the night. Then, I purchased a GPS tracker to place under her car. It was a risky move, but if I was going to confront her, I needed to know exactly where she was going when she wasn't working late. Finally, I downloaded software that would allow me to clone her phone. I had read about it online, an app that mirrored everything on her device to mine. Texts, calls, even location data. That would give me a front-row seat to her deception. I justified it as protecting my family, though it felt dirty, like I was sinking to her level. Still, I couldn't see any other way to get to the truth. The hardest part was waiting. Every time she laughed at a message on her phone or gave some vague excuse for why she had to work late again, it took everything in me not to snap. My stomach churned with a mixture of rage and heartbreak every time she kissed me goodnight, her lips brushing mine like nothing had changed. Monday night was when I finally put my plan into action. I told Brianna I had to work late myself and left the house around 7 p.m., just as she was settling in for another busy night of emails. Instead of going to the office, I parked down the street and waited. I kept an eye on the house, watching as the lights flickered between the living room and the kitchen. When I was sure she was distracted, I slipped back inside, installed the camera in the living room, and placed the GPS tracker under her car in the driveway. I had never felt so nervous. My heart pounded with every step, my hands shaking as I adjusted the camera angle to ensure it covered the entire room. If she caught me, I didn't know what I'd say. But she didn't. By the time I slipped back out, she was still in the kitchen, humming to herself as though she didn't have a care in the world. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, watching the live feed from the camera on my phone. It felt like hours of nothing until, just past 11, her phone lit up with a notification. She glanced at it, smiled, and texted back. A few minutes later, she picked up the phone and dialed a number. I turned up the volume, my heart pounding in my ears as I heard her soft, familiar voice. "Hey," she said, her tone lighter than it had been with me in weeks. "I was thinking about you too." "No, he's asleep." "Yeah, the kids are too." I didn't need to hear more. My hands trembled as I hit the record button on my phone. Every word that followed cut deeper than the last. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll make up an excuse to stay late again. Just make sure we don't get caught, okay?" I ended the recording and sat back in my chair, numb. It was happening. It was real. But now I had the proof I needed. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. Tuesday was a quiet storm brewing inside me. I went about my day pretending everything was fine. I kissed Brianna goodbye as she left for work, packed the kids' lunches, and dropped them off at school. But inside, the rage and heartbreak boiled, waiting for its release. I spent the morning reviewing the footage from the previous night. Every second of her hushed conversation replayed in my mind like a knife, twisting deeper into my chest. I could feel the pieces falling into place, her lies unraveling into a clear picture of betrayal. Her sweet goodnights, the long hours at work, the exhaustion she blamed on stress. It all made sense now. She wasn't tired. She was busy being someone else's wife in secret. As I watched the footage, I noticed something else, a pattern. It wasn't just the phone calls. She had a routine. The way she checked the window before sitting on the couch, how she changed into more casual clothes when she got home. Everything seemed calculated. She was comfortable in her deceit. Too comfortable. The GPS tracker sent its first ping just before noon. Her car, which was supposed to be parked outside her office, had moved. I checked the location and saw it wasn't anywhere near her work. Instead, it was at a restaurant downtown, a high-end place we had never been to. My stomach churned as I realized what this meant. She was meeting him in broad daylight. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. I waited for the next update, my heart racing as I imagined them sitting together, laughing at their private jokes, planning their next rendezvous. When the tracker showed her leaving the restaurant, I knew where she was headed. To him. To Patrick Coleman. My phone buzzed, and I glanced down to see a notification from the phone cloning app. A new message had come through. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat as I read it. "Brianna, lunch was perfect. Can't wait for tonight. Love you." The reply came seconds later. "Patrick, I'll make sure everything's ready. Love you too." It was a punch to the gut, one that left me winded and shaking with fury. They didn't even bother with subtlety. They were in love. At least they thought they were, and they thought I was too blind to notice. I spent the rest of the day preparing. The camera was already in place, and the GPS would keep me updated on her movements. What I needed now was leverage, not just for the divorce, but to protect myself, my kids, and everything I had worked for. By the time evening came, I was ready. Brianna came home looking radiant, her smile brighter than it had been in weeks. She kissed me on the cheek, told me she had another late night ahead, and hurried upstairs to change. I watched her go, every step confirming what I already knew. Tonight she was going to him. Once she left, I followed the GPS tracker to the hotel downtown. I parked a safe distance away and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Just after 8 p.m., her car pulled into the lot. A few minutes later, Patrick arrived in his sleek black sedan. They walked in together, laughing, his hand brushing the small of her back like it was the most natural thing in the world. I followed them inside, careful to stay out of sight. They checked into a room, one I made sure to note down, and disappeared upstairs. My pulse was racing, my hands shaking, but I couldn't afford to lose my focus. I approached the front desk, keeping my tone calm and casual. "Excuse me," I said, slipping the clerk a folded $50 bill. "I need to know who's in room 214. I'm supposed to meet someone there, but forgot the name they used." The clerk hesitated for a moment before glancing at the register. "Patrick Coleman," she said softly, pocketing the cash. "Enjoy your night." I forced a smile and walked away. I had everything I needed now. Names times locations. The evidence was stacking up, and with it, my resolve. As I drove home, the weight of the truth pressed down on me, suffocating but liberating at the same time. Tonight wasn't about confrontation. It was about preparation. They thought they were untouchable, but they were wrong. Tomorrow, they'd learn exactly how wrong they were. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling the weight of what I'd witnessed the night before. Sleep had been fleeting, my mind racing with questions and anger. Brianna had come home late, slipping into bed as if nothing had happened. I lay there, listening to her even breathing, my heart torn between sorrow and rage. But I had a plan, and I was going to see it through. Over breakfast, Brianna was cheerful, almost glowing. She kissed the kids goodbye and told me she might have to stay late again. I played along, smiling, pretending to believe her. Every word she spoke was like a dagger, twisting deeper with the knowledge of her betrayal. As soon as she left, I began organizing my evidence. The recordings, the GPS data, and the messages, they painted a damning picture of her affair. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a deliberate and calculated betrayal that stretched far deeper than I'd initially imagined. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. While reviewing the footage from the living room camera, something unexpected caught my attention. Brianna and Patrick weren't just meeting for clandestine dates. They were discussing financial plans, specifically ways to ensure Patrick's new promotion at their firm would allow him to take care of her and help her start fresh. The words hit me like a freight train. They were planning a future together, a future that didn't include me. I leaned closer, my breath catching as the conversation continued. Brianna mentioned assets. She talked about the house, the kids, and even my retirement account. Patrick reassured her, promising that his connections would make sure she got everything she deserved. Everything she deserved? The fury that coursed through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Not only was she cheating, but she was actively plotting to take everything I'd built. The home I worked tirelessly to provide, the savings I'd set aside for our kids' future. And Patrick was complicit, enabling her every step of the way. I knew I had to act quickly. The first call I made was to my attorney, a no-nonsense guy named Eric who had handled a few business contracts for me in the past. I explained the situation in vague terms, careful not to reveal too much over the phone. "Eric, I need to protect my assets," I said, my voice tight. "Can you help me draft an agreement or something?" "Sounds serious," Eric replied. "Let's meet today. Noon work for you?" "It's perfect." "Thanks, Eric." After the call, I turned my attention to another matter that had been gnawing at me since the affair came to light. The kids. Connor and Emily were my pride and joy, and I'd always assumed they were mine. But now, with everything I'd learned about Brianna's deceit, I couldn't ignore the nagging doubt that crept into my mind. I ordered a DNA testing kit online, one that promised quick results. It felt like a betrayal of my own children to even consider the possibility, but I needed the truth. Whatever happened next, I needed to know where I stood. At noon, I met Eric at his downtown office. He was sharp as ever, taking in the situation without judgment. "Matthew," he said, leaning back in his chair, "from what you're telling me, you've got a strong case for protecting yourself. If she's been unfaithful and is planning to leave you, you'll need to act fast to safeguard your finances. Do you have any evidence?" "I do," I replied, sliding my phone across the desk. "Texts, videos, GPS logs. It's all here." Eric spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the files, his face growing darker with each passing moment. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hard. "This is bad, Matthew. But it's also good. With this evidence, you'll have leverage in the divorce. We can work on freezing joint accounts and ensuring the house remains in your name until this is resolved. But I need to warn you, this won't be pretty. Nothing about this is, I said bitterly. What do we do next? Eric outlined a plan that involved filing for divorce on grounds of infidelity while simultaneously protecting my assets. He also advised me to confront Brianna, but only after the legal papers were in place. Don't give her a chance to move money around or get ahead of you, he warned. Once you confront her, she might panic. I left Eric's office feeling slightly more in control, though the storm of emotions inside me hadn't abated. I had a plan now, a way to fight back and protect what mattered most. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the image of Brianna and Patrick sitting together, laughing, plotting. The betrayal was more than personal now. It was an attack on everything I had worked to build. But they underestimated me. That night, as Brianna kissed me goodnight and turned out the light, I stared at the ceiling, my mind churning with everything that was to come. The countdown to confrontation had begun. The next morning started like any other, but it felt like I was walking into battle. I kissed the kids goodbye as they left for school, packed their lunches with a mechanical precision, and said goodbye to Brianna as she headed to work. She smiled at me, her everything is normal smile, and for a fleeting moment, I almost believed it. But then I remembered what was at stake and steeled myself. Once she left, I turned my attention to the DNA test kits I had received in the mail late last night. I felt guilty even considering it, but after everything I'd uncovered, I couldn't take anything for granted. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The process was straightforward. Swab, seal, send. I waited until the kids were home from school, casually asked them to help with a fun science project, and got their samples without raising any suspicion. They were none the wiser as they ran off to play in the backyard. I added my own sample and sealed the kit, dropping it in the mailbox before I could overthink it. The results wouldn't come for a few days, but I knew they would either bring me clarity or deliver the final blow. That evening, I reviewed everything again. The texts, the GPS logs, the recordings. It was all neatly organized now, saved on both my laptop and an external drive. Eric had given me clear instructions. Don't leave anything in one place, and always have a backup. I followed his advice to the letter. Just after 8 p.m., I received the ping I'd been waiting for. Brianna's GPS tracker showed her leaving the office, but instead of heading home, her car made its way to the same hotel from before. The routine was so blatant now that it almost felt insulting. Did she really think I was so oblivious? I had made a decision earlier in the day. Tonight would be the night. No more waiting, no more collecting evidence. It was time to confront her, but I needed to do it on my terms. I called Cassidy, my secretary. She'd been my right hand for years, someone I trusted implicitly. We'd worked together long enough that she knew when something was off. "Hey, Matthew," she answered, her voice bright but tinged with concern. "You okay? You seem a little distracted this week." "'Cause I need a favor," I said, my voice low. "And I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." "Of course," she said immediately. "What's going on?" I explained everything. Brianna's affair, the evidence, the financial concerns, and the meeting with Eric. I laid it all out, sparing no detail. By the time I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Matthew, I'm so sorry," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "You don't deserve this." "I don't need pity," I said, though the kindness in her tone brought a lump to my throat. "I need your help. Eric says I need to act fast, and I can't do it alone." "I'm with you," she said without hesitation. "What do you need me to do?" We worked out the details quickly. Cassidy would help me organize the financial documents Eric had requested and ensure all my personal accounts were secure. She'd also handle any fallout at work if things got messy, which they undoubtedly would. Knowing she was in my corner gave me the strength I needed to face what was coming next. At 10 p.m., Brianna walked through the door. She looked tired, her makeup slightly smudged, but she greeted me with the same practiced warmth she always did. "Long day?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual. "Exhausting," she said, dropping her bag by the couch. "I just need a shower and some sleep." I nodded, watching her carefully. "You deserve it," I said, my tone even. You've been working so hard lately." Her smile faltered for the briefest of moments, but she recovered quickly. "Thanks, babe. I'll be up soon." I waited until she disappeared into the shower before retrieving the external drive from its hiding spot. I placed it on the dining table, along with the neatly printed copies of the texts, GPS logs, and photos. It was all there, laid out in black and white. There would be no excuses, no gaslighting, no room for lies. When she finally emerged, her hair wrapped in a towel, she stopped short at the sight of the table. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Sit down," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. She hesitated but did as I asked. I sat across from her, my hands folded, my gaze steady. "I know everything, Brianna." I began, my voice calm but laced with the weight of my anger. "About Patrick, about the affair, about your plans to take everything and start fresh." Her eyes widened, her face paling as she glanced at the evidence in front of her. For a moment, she said nothing, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Matthew, it's not what you think," she stammered. "I can explain." "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "I've given you every chance to be honest with me, and you've done nothing but lie. This isn't about misunderstandings or mistakes, Brianna. This is about betrayal." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't waver. She wasn't the victim here. I was. "You've made your choices," I continued, my voice steady. "Now it's time for me to make mine." I pushed the divorce papers across the table toward her, my heart pounding as I waited for her reaction. Her lips trembled as she stared at them, the weight of what was happening finally sinking in. But instead of apologizing or begging for forgiveness, she looked up at me with defiance. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low. "You don't get to just walk away and take everything." I leaned back in my chair, my gaze unwavering. "We'll see about that." The battle lines were drawn. The next morning felt surreal. The confrontation with Brianna had been the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. And yet, life outside our walls continued as if nothing had changed. The kids still needed breakfast. Bills still needed to be paid. But inside me, a storm raged. Brianna had barely said a word after I handed her the divorce papers the night before. She signed them reluctantly, under the pressure of the overwhelming evidence and my warning that if she fought me, it would only make things worse. She spent the night in the guest room, and I didn't sleep at all. I called Eric first thing in the morning to update him. She signed, "I told him," but she's not going to go quietly. Eric sighed on the other end of the line. That's to be expected. Betrayal like this has a way of getting messy. The good news is, with the evidence we have, we're in a strong position. Did she admit anything? Not exactly, I said. But she knows she's been caught. She tried to spin it, but I shut it down. What happens next? We file, he said firmly. Once the papers are submitted, the legal process begins. You've got a good case, but you need to prepare for her to challenge it. Financially, emotionally, this won't be easy. I'm ready, I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Thanks, Eric. After the call, I turned my attention to the next loose end, Patrick Coleman. I couldn't let him walk away unscathed. He wasn't just some random guy. He was her boss, the one who had encouraged and enabled this entire mess. And as I discovered during my review of the evidence, he had been abusing his power at the firm to manipulate Brianna and likely others. I decided to go straight to the top. That afternoon, I called the managing partner of Patrick's firm, a no-nonsense woman named Claire Daniels. Ms. Daniels, my name is Matthew Carter. I began, keeping my voice calm but firm. I'm calling to inform you about some troubling behavior involving one of your employees, Patrick Coleman. There was a pause on the line, and then her voice came through, clipped and professional. Go on. I laid it all out for her. The affair, the texts, the misuse of company time and resources. I didn't pull any punches, and by the end of the call, Claire's tone had shifted. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice now laced with barely contained anger. I assure you this matter will be addressed immediately. We take ethics and workplace behavior very seriously here. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. By the time I hung up, I felt a glimmer of satisfaction. Patrick's world was about to crumble, and it was only the beginning. I had plans to ensure that neither he nor Brianna walked away from this unscathed. Later that evening, Brianna emerged from the guest room, her expression a mixture of anger and desperation. "You called my boss," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I know exactly what I've done," I replied, meeting her glare with an icy calm. "I'm cleaning up the mess you and Patrick made. If there are consequences, they're yours to face." Her face twisted in anger, and for a moment I thought she might lash out. But instead, she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet triumph. Brianna had underestimated me, just as Patrick had. They thought they could betray me, humiliate me, and take everything without consequence. But they were wrong. In the quiet of the house, I found myself thinking about Cassidy. She'd been a rock throughout this ordeal, helping me navigate the chaos with calm determination. I hadn't realized how much I leaned on her until now, and the thought brought a warmth to my otherwise heavy heart. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a small smile. The storm wasn't over, but I was starting to see a path forward, and I wasn't walking it alone. The fallout from my call to Patrick's firm was swift. By the next morning, the entire situation had spiraled out of Brianna's and Patrick's control. Claire Daniels wasn't one to tolerate misconduct, especially from someone in a leadership role. Patrick was placed on immediate suspension, pending an internal investigation, and his name was being whispered throughout the firm as someone who had crossed the line. Brianna, on the other hand, had been called in for questioning. She returned home early, her face pale and eyes wide with barely suppressed panic. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "They're going to fire me," she said, storming into the living room where I sat with my laptop. "Do you realize what you've done?" "What you've done," I corrected coldly, not even looking up. "Actions have consequences, Brianna. Maybe you should have thought about that before you cheated on your husband and brought your personal mess into your professional life." She threw her bag onto the couch, her hands trembling. "You're destroying everything, Matthew. The kids, the house, my career. You're ruining it all." I closed my laptop, stood, and looked her straight in the eye. "You did this, Brianna. You. Not me. You betrayed this family. And now you're upset because the lies you built your life on are collapsing. Don't blame me for the choices you made." Her lip trembled as though she wanted to fire back, but no words came. Instead, she sat down on the couch, burying her face in her hands. I didn't have it in me to comfort her. Not anymore. I walked out of the room, letting her sit in the wreckage she created. That afternoon, the DNA results came in. My stomach churned as I opened the email, my hands trembling as I clicked through the confirmation screens. I had prepared myself for the worst, but nothing could have braced me for the words staring back at me. Emily Carter, 0% probability of paternity. Connor Carter, 0% probability of paternity. The world spun, the air rushing out of my lungs as though I'd been punched. My children, my babies weren't mine. The betrayal hit me like a second wave, even deeper than the affair. This wasn't just a marriage destroyed. It was the foundation of my identity as a father crumbling beneath me. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. Emily's laugh, Connor's bedtime hugs, all the sleepless nights and milestones. They weren't tied to me by blood, but they were still mine in every way that mattered, weren't they? Or was I just fooling myself? I didn't know how long I sat there, numb and unable to process the enormity of what I'd just learned. But eventually, I made a decision. The kids would never know. They didn't deserve to be dragged into this nightmare. As far as I was concerned, I was still their father, and I'd fight to protect them from the fallout of Brianna's choices. That night, Brianna approached me cautiously, her anger seemingly replaced with a flicker of guilt. "Matthew," she began hesitantly, "can we talk?" I turned to face her, my expression blank. "About what?" "About everything," she said, her voice breaking. I made a mistake, a huge mistake, but I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose this family." I laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the tension like a blade. "You didn't just make a mistake, Brianna. You made choices. Over and over again. You lied, you cheated, And now you want to salvage what's left? Do you honestly think that's possible? She flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. I love you, she whispered. I know I've hurt you, but... Stop. I interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't say that. Don't insult me by pretending this was ever about love. You don't love me, Brianna. You love the life I built for you. And now that it's slipping away, you're scrambling to hold on to it. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't waver. I'd given her too much of my heart already. It was time to protect what little remained. I'm filing the papers tomorrow, I said, my voice steady. And I'll be seeking full custody of the kids. Her head snapped up, her face a mask of panic. You can't do that, she said, her voice shaking. You can't take them from me? I can, I said coldly. And I will. You've proven you can't be trusted. Not as a wife, and certainly not as a mother. I walked past her, leaving her standing in the living room as the reality of her situation set in. She had no idea about the DNA results, and I intended to keep it that way. Emily and Connor were my kids, no matter what the test said. I wasn't about to let her ruin their lives the way she had ruined ours. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The pain of the betrayal was still raw, but beneath it was a determination I hadn't felt in years. I was going to rebuild my life. I was going to protect my kids. And I wasn't going to let Brianna's lies define me. This was far from over, but for the first time I felt like I was in control. The morning after receiving the DNA results, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The weight of Brianna's betrayal and the shocking revelation about the kids had hardened my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for Emily and Connor, for their future and mine. Brianna seemed to sense the shift. She avoided me at breakfast, her eyes darting away whenever I looked in her direction. She was nervous, perhaps realizing the control she thought she had was slipping through her fingers. But I wasn't playing her games anymore. I had a meeting with Eric later that day, and I planned to finalize the divorce filings and set the wheels in motion to secure custody. As I left the house, Brianna stopped me at the door. Matthew, she said softly, her voice hesitant. Can we talk tonight? Please. I stared at her for a long moment. We'll talk when there's something left worth discussing, I said curtly, walking out without waiting for her reply. At Eric's office, I laid everything on the table. The evidence of her affair, the financial records, the GPS logs, and now, the DNA results. Eric's reaction was a mix of disbelief and determination. The DNA changes everything, he said, leaning back in his chair. Legally, it gives you grounds to sever financial ties if you choose to. But more importantly, it strengthens your case for custody. Are you prepared for the fight this could become? I'm prepared for whatever it takes, I said firmly. The kids are my world, Eric. I don't care what biology says. I raised them. They're mine. He nodded. Good. Let's file the papers and make sure everything is airtight. Brianna won't take this lying down. As we finalized the documents, Eric gave me one more piece of advice. Don't tell her about the DNA results unless you absolutely have to. It could escalate things unnecessarily, and the courts may not even consider it relevant unless she brings it up. Focus on the kids' well-being and let the rest fall into place. I agreed. The DNA results were my burden to bear, not Emily's and Connor's. They deserved stability, not the chaos Brianna had unleashed. When I returned home that evening, Brianna was waiting for me in the living room. She had clearly been crying, her face blotchy and her eyes swollen. For a moment, I almost felt pity for her. But then I remembered everything she'd done, and the pity vanished. Matthew, she began, her voice trembling. I know I've hurt you. I know I've made mistakes. But can we at least try to fix this? For the kids. I let out a bitter laugh. For the kids? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You're worried about the kids now, after everything you've done? Don't insult me, Brianna. Her tears spilled over, but I didn't relent. You didn't think about the kids when you were sneaking off to hotels. You didn't think about them when you were lying to my face every single day. And now, you want to act like you care? It's too late. She sobbed openly now, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the couch. I still love you, she whispered. I made a mistake, but Stop, I said sharply, cutting her off. You don't love me, Brianna. You love yourself. And now you're scared because you're losing control. Well, let me make this clear. I'm filing for divorce. I'm filing for full custody of the kids. And I'm going to make sure you and Patrick pay for every single lie you told. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might try to argue. But then, something in her eyes shifted. The guilt and sorrow were replaced with anger, a sharp, vindictive fury that made my stomach turn. You think you're so righteous, she spat. But you're not perfect, Matthew. You're cold and controlling, and maybe if you'd been the husband I needed, I wouldn't have turned to Patrick in the first place. Her words stung, but I refused to let her see it. Blame me all you want, I said coldly. It doesn't change the fact that you destroyed this family, not me. And now, you're going to live with the consequences. I walked away, leaving her sobbing on the couch. Upstairs, I checked on Emily and Connor, who were already asleep. Watching them, my chest tightened with a mix of love and sorrow. They were innocent in all of this, caught in a storm they didn't deserve. I kissed each of them on the forehead, silently vowing to protect them from the chaos their mother had created. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing. The confrontation with Brianna had only solidified my decision. There was no going back, no salvaging what was already broken. The only path forward was to fight, to protect my kids, my home, and what little remained of the life I'd worked so hard to build. But as I stared at the ceiling, another thought crept in, unbidden but persistent. Cassidy. She had been my rock through all of this, her unwavering support a light in the darkness. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The battle was far from over, but I wasn't fighting it alone, and that made all the difference. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal meetings, quiet planning, and carefully shielding Emily and Connor from the chaos brewing between Brianna and me. I had filed the divorce papers, and the ball was rolling. The tension in the house was unbearable. Brianna avoided me, and I avoided her. Every interaction felt like a battlefield, but I refused to let her see me falter. One evening, as I was reviewing the latest custody paperwork from Eric, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Cassidy. Hey, just checking in. How are you holding up? Her simple message brought a wave of unexpected comfort. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to ask that question. Someone who genuinely cared. I'm surviving, he replied. Thanks for asking. How are you? She replied almost immediately. I'm okay. Just worried about you. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I wanted to unload, but I didn't want to burden her. Still, the idea of seeing her, even just for a few minutes, felt like a lifeline. Actually, could we meet for coffee tomorrow? I could use a friend. Her response was quick and warm. Of course. Just say when and where. The next day, we met at a small cafe tucked away from the chaos of my life. When I saw her sitting by the window, a gentle smile on her face, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. She looked up as I approached, her eyes filled with concern and something else, something softer, almost protective. Hey, she said, standing to hug me. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a bomb on a deep wound. Hey, I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. We sat down, and for a moment, I just stared at my coffee, unsure where to start. You don't have to say anything, she said softly, her voice cutting through my hesitation. I'm here for you, whatever you need. Her kindness was my undoing. The walls I'd been holding up crumbled, and I found myself telling her everything. The affair, the betrayal, the DNA results, my fight for custody. She listened intently, her hands folded on the table, her expression a mixture of empathy and quiet anger on my behalf. Matthew, she said when I finished, her voice firm but kind. You've been through hell, but you're handling it with so much strength. Your kids are lucky to have you. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I don't feel strong, I admitted. I feel like I'm barely holding it together. She reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. You're stronger than you think, and you don't have to do this alone. The warmth of her touch, the sincerity in her eyes, it was like a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. When I returned home, the atmosphere was tense as usual. Brianna was in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with something, but I ignored her. I went straight upstairs to check on the kids, finding them both sprawled out on the floor of Connor's room, playing a board game. "Dad!" Emily exclaimed when she saw me, her face lighting up. "Connor's cheating." "I am not," Connor protested, laughing. I smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "Well, let's see what's going on here," I said, sitting down with them. For the next hour, I let myself forget about Brianna, about the betrayal, about the battle ahead. In that moment, it was just me and my kids, laughing and playing and pretending the world wasn't falling apart. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Cassidy, her presence, her words. They'd been a light in the darkness, a reminder that not everything in my life was broken. For so long, I'd seen her as my trusted colleague, someone I could count on at work. But now, I was starting to see her in a different light. She wasn't just a friend. She was a source of strength, of hope. But I pushed the thought aside. It was too soon, too complicated. I had to focus on the fight ahead, on protecting Emily and Connor. There was no room for anything else. Still, as I drifted off to sleep, the image of her smile lingered in my mind, a small flicker of hope in an otherwise dark and uncertain world. The days following my coffee with Cassidy were calmer, but the tension with Brianna remained ever present. She stayed out of my way, yet there was a growing unease in the air, as if she was waiting to strike back. I knew she wouldn't accept the divorce and custody battle without a fight, but I wasn't going to let her manipulate me or the kids any further. Eric called midweek with an update. "The paperwork's been filed," he said. "She'll be officially served tomorrow. Once that happens, things might escalate. Be prepared." I thanked him and hung up, my stomach twisting with anticipation. Brianna had no idea what was coming, and part of me dreaded the inevitable explosion. But it had to be done. That evening, I decided to spend more time with Emily and Connor. We ordered pizza, watched movies, and for a few hours the house felt normal again. Seeing them laugh and enjoy themselves reminded me why I was fighting so hard. They deserved a stable home, free from Brianna's lies and the chaos she had created. The next day, Brianna was served at work. I knew because she came home early, her face red with fury. She stormed into the living room where I was working, waving the divorce papers in her hand. "How dare you file for full custody?" she hissed, her voice shaking with anger. "You're trying to take my children away from me." "They're not just your children," I said calmly, meeting her glare. "They're mine too, and I'm doing what's best for them." "You don't get to decide that," she shouted. "You're being vindictive, Matthew. This isn't about the kids. It's about punishing me." I stood up, keeping my voice steady. "This is about protecting them from the choices you made, Brianna. You're the one who betrayed this family. Don't forget that." Her expression twisted with a mix of guilt and rage. But before she could respond, Connor came running into the room, holding his favorite toy truck. "Mom, Dad, can you stop fighting?" he asked, his small voice breaking through the tension. "It's too loud." Brianna and I froze, guilt washing over both of us. I crouched down to Connor's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, buddy," I said softly. "We didn't mean to upset you." Brianna's anger seemed to deflate in the face of our son's innocent plea. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We'll try to keep it down," she murmured. As Connor ran back upstairs, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Brianna stared at me, her expression unreadable. "This isn't over," she said quietly before turning and walking away. Later that night, I received a message from Cassidy. "How's it going? Did she get served?" "She did," I replied. "It wasn't pretty." She called a few minutes later, her voice warm and steady. "Want to talk about it?" I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to rehash the confrontation. But something about her voice, the way she always seemed to know exactly what to say, made me let my guard down. "She's angry," I admitted. "She's trying to make it about me punishing her, but all I care about is the kids." "And you're doing the right thing," she said firmly. "Don't let her twist it around. You're protecting them, Matthew. That's what matters." Her words were like a balm, soothing the raw edges of my emotions. We talked for over an hour about everything and nothing, and by the time we hung up, I felt lighter. The following day, Eric called with another update. "I've received her lawyer's response," he said. "She's challenging the custody claim, as expected. But they're not denying the affair or the financial misconduct." "That's something at least," I said. "What's our next step?" "We'll prepare for mediation, but don't expect it to go smoothly," he warned. "If she's not willing to compromise, we'll take it to court." I sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "I'll do whatever it takes, Eric. I'm not backing down." "I know," he said, "and you've got a strong case. Stay the course." That evening, I found myself thinking about Cassidy again. Her unwavering support, her kindness. It had become a lifeline in the storm. She had been there for me in ways I hadn't even realized I needed, and the thought of her brought a sense of comfort I hadn't felt in weeks. I wasn't ready to explore what those feelings meant, not yet. But as I sat in the quiet of the house, watching Emily and Connor play, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for me beyond the wreckage of my marriage. A future that didn't just include healing but hope. The mediation day arrived faster than I anticipated. I had steeled myself for the battle ahead, but sitting in the conference room with Brianna across the table was a level of discomfort I hadn't prepared for. She looked defiant, her lawyer whispering in her ear while she glared at me. I met her gaze without flinching. Eric leaned over, his voice low and firm. "Stay calm. Let her dig her own grave. We have the evidence, remember?" I nodded, gripping the edge of the table. The mediator, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, called the session to order. "Let's begin," she said, her tone businesslike. "We're here to discuss custody arrangements for Emily and Connor. Both parents have expressed a desire for full custody, so our goal today is to find common ground and avoid court if possible." Brianna's lawyer wasted no time. "My client is a loving and dedicated mother," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "She has been the primary caregiver for the children since birth. Mr. Carter's demands for full custody are baseless and punitive, stemming from personal grievances rather than the children's best interests." I clenched my jaw, willing myself to stay quiet as Eric took the floor. "Mr. Carter is seeking full custody because of Ms. Carter's pattern of deceit and irresponsibility," he said, his tone measured but firm. "We have ample evidence of her extramarital affair, which involved introducing the children to her lover under the guise of work-related activities. Furthermore, her financial misconduct has placed the family's stability at risk." The mediator frowned. "Do you have evidence of this?" Eric slid a folder across the table, filled with the texts, GPS logs, and photos I'd painstakingly gathered. Brianna's lawyer glanced at the documents and paled slightly. Brianna's expression tightened, but she said nothing. The mediator took her time reviewing the evidence, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. Finally, she looked up. "This is concerning, Ms. Carter. Do you have a response to these claims?" Brianna hesitated, her usual confidence faltering. I made mistakes," she stammered. "But I've always put the kids first. They're my life." Eric pounced. "Putting the kids first doesn't involve lying to their father, exposing them to questionable relationships, or jeopardizing the family's financial security. Mr. Carter has been a constant presence in their lives, providing stability and support. His only concern is their well-being." The mediator turned to me. "Mr. Carter, if awarded full custody, how do you plan to support the children emotionally and financially?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Emily and Connor are my world," I said, my voice firm but calm. "I've always been there for them, and I always will be. My goal is to provide them with a stable, loving home. I'm financially secure, with a steady income and savings to ensure their needs are met. This isn't about revenge. It's about protecting them from the instability and deceit that have plagued our household." The mediator nodded, her expression neutral but thoughtful. She turned back to Brianna. "Ms. Carter, do you have anything else to add?" Brianna's face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might admit defeat. But then her lawyer whispered something in her ear, and she straightened, her eyes flashing with anger. "This is a smear campaign," she said, her voice trembling. Matthew is trying to paint me as a terrible mother because he's angry about the divorce. He's using the kids as pawns, and it's disgusting. I stared at her, my heart pounding with a mix of fury and disbelief. Before I could respond, the mediator held up a hand. "That's enough," she said sharply. "This is not the place for personal attacks. We're here to focus on the children's needs, not to litigate your marital issues." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The mediator glanced between us, her expression unreadable. "Given the evidence presented, I recommend that Mr. Carter retain primary custody, with Ms. Carter receiving supervised visitation until the court can review the case further." Brianna's gasp echoed in the room. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice breaking. "They're my children." The mediator's gaze hardened. "Ms. Carter, I suggest you use this time to demonstrate your commitment to your children's well-being. Any further outbursts will not help your case." The drive home was quiet, but my thoughts were anything but. The mediator's recommendation was a win, but it felt bittersweet. Emily and Connor didn't deserve this battle, and I hated that it had come to this. When I walked into the house, Emily and Connor ran to greet me, their laughter momentarily washing away the day's weight. I scooped them up, holding them close, silently vowing to shield them from the chaos. Later, after tucking them in a bed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Cassidy. "How did it go?" I hesitated for a moment before replying. "We made progress. It's looking good for custody, but it's not over yet." Her response came almost immediately. "You're doing amazing, Matthew. I'm proud of you." Those words stayed with me long after I put the phone down. They were a reminder that even in the midst of this storm, I wasn't alone. I stared out the window, the house quiet around me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally gaining ground, like the life Brianna had tried to destroy was slowly being rebuilt. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something new. The mediator's recommendation was a victory, but I knew it wasn't the end. Brianna's fury simmered just below the surface, her every glance and word laced with resentment. She didn't lash out in front of the kids, but when they were out of earshot, her anger was palpable. "You're poisoning them against me," she accused one night, her voice low but venomous as I cleaned up after dinner. I didn't look at her. "I've done no such thing. They're kids. They don't need to be dragged into this." "You think you're the better parent," she continued, her voice trembling with frustration. "But you're just as flawed as I am." I set down the dish I was holding and turned to face her. "The difference, Brianna, is that I didn't lie. I didn't cheat, and I didn't jeopardize this family. This mess? It's yours." Her face reddened, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The next day, Eric called with an update. "Brianna's lawyer filed a motion to contest the mediator's recommendation," he said. "They're pushing for unsupervised visitation and trying to paint you as overly controlling." "Of course they are," I muttered. "What's our move?" "We stick to the facts," he said firmly. "The evidence is on your side, and her outbursts during mediation didn't do her any favors. But be prepared. She may try to use anything she can against you. Financials, your parenting style, even your work hours. Stay calm and let us handle it." I thanked him and hung up, my stomach churning. Brianna was desperate, and desperate people made reckless choices. I needed to stay ahead of her. That evening, as I was tucking Connor into bed, he looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Dad, is Mom mad at you?" The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask, buddy?" He fiddled with the edge of his blanket, his small fingers tugging at the fabric. "She talks on the phone a lot when you're not around. She says things about you." My chest tightened. "What kinds of things?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "She says you're trying to take us away from her. But you wouldn't do that, right?" I sat down on the edge of his bed, my heart breaking for him. "Connor, I would never take you and Emily away from anyone who loves you. I'm just trying to make sure you both have a safe, happy home. That's all." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "Okay, Dad. I love you." "I love you too, buddy," I said, kissing his forehead. As I left his room, a new wave of anger rolled over me. Brianna wasn't just trying to fight me in court. She was planting seeds of doubt in our kids' minds. I wouldn't let her win. The following day, I received a call from the kids' school. The principal wanted to meet with me regarding an incident involving Emily. My heart sank as I drove to the school, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When I arrived, the principal greeted me with a polite but serious expression. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Carter," she said, motioning for me to sit. "We've noticed some changes in Emily's behavior recently. She's been quieter, more withdrawn. Today, she told one of her teachers that she's worried her parents are going to stop loving her." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "She said that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The principal nodded. "We understand that families go through difficult times, but it's important to ensure that Emily feels supported. Have you considered family counseling?" I clenched my hands in my lap, guilt gnawing at me. "I'll look into it," I promised. "Thank you for letting me know." That evening, I sat down with both Emily and Connor. We talked about their feelings, their fears, and how much they meant to me. I reassured them that no matter what happened between their mother and me, our love for them would never change. But as I held them close, a bitter thought crept into my mind. Brianna's actions weren't just hurting me. They were tearing at the kids, too. And I couldn't forgive her for that. After they were in bed, I called Cassidy. I didn't know what else to do. She picked up on the second ring, her voice instantly calming. "Hey, what's going on?" she asked, concern lacing her words. I told her about Emily's fears and the principal's suggestion. "I feel like I'm failing them," I admitted, my voice breaking. "No matter how hard I try, they're still caught in the middle." "Matthew," she said softly, "you're doing everything you can. They see that. They know you love them. This isn't your fault. It's Brianna's mess, not yours." Her words brought me back from the edge. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You don't have to do this alone," she replied. "I'm here always." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything. Emily's fears, Connor's questions, Brianna's games. The fight was far from over, but I was more determined than ever to protect my kids and rebuild our lives. And as I drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered. With people like Eric and Cassidy in my corner, I might just come out of this stronger than I'd ever imagined. The court hearing for temporary custody was scheduled for the following week. The days leading up to it felt like an eternity. Brianna was unnervingly quiet, her once fiery demeanor replaced with a simmering silence. It was as though she was regrouping, preparing for her next move. I stayed vigilant, knowing that her silence was not surrender. I spent the time with Emily and Connor as much as possible, reinforcing our bond and making sure they felt safe. We painted pictures, played games, and even baked cookies, things that gave them moments of happiness amid the storm. I refused to let Brianna's chaos seep into their lives any further. The morning of the hearing arrived. As I sat in the courtroom, waiting for the judge to enter, I couldn't help but glance at Brianna. She was dressed sharply, her lawyer at her side, whispering to her as she nodded stiffly. Her defiance was back, and her eyes darted toward me with a mix of anger and something that almost looked like regret. Eric leaned over. "Stay calm. The evidence is solid, and her behavior during mediation will work against her." I nodded, though my heart was pounding. The judge entered, a woman with a commanding presence who wasted no time. She reviewed the case summary and listened to opening statements from both sides. Brianna's lawyer painted her as a devoted mother who had made mistakes but was deeply committed to her children. He tried to discredit me by implying I was vindictive and controlling, but Eric swiftly countered with the evidence. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, my hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through me. "Your Honor," I began, "this isn't about punishing Brianna for what she's done to me. It's about ensuring my children have a stable, loving environment. I've always been there for Emily and Connor, and I'll continue to be there for them. My only concern is their well-being." The judge nodded thoughtfully, her gaze shifting to Brianna. "Ms. Carter, do you have anything to say?" Brianna stood, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I made mistakes, Your Honor, but I love my children, and I don't believe they should be taken away from me. I'm their mother. They need me." Her words rang hollow to me, but I could see she was trying to play to the court's emotions. The judge, however, remained stoic. After reviewing the evidence and considering both arguments, the judge issued her decision. Mr. Carter will retain temporary primary custody of the children, with Ms. Carter receiving supervised visitation twice a week. A full custody hearing will be scheduled in the coming months. Brianna gasped audibly, her composure slipping. "This isn't fair," she exclaimed, but her lawyer quickly pulled her aside, whispering urgently. The judge ignored the outburst and dismissed the court. When we left the courtroom, Eric clapped me on the shoulder. "This is a big win, Matthew. You handled yourself well." "Thanks," I said, though I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Winning temporary custody was a victory, but the reality of the situation still weighed heavily on me. Emily and Connor were my priority, but they would still feel the effects of this mess no matter how hard I tried to shield them. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a message from Cassidy. "How did it go?" I pulled over before replying. "Temporary custody is mine. Supervised visits for her." Her response came almost instantly. "That's amazing. You're one step closer to giving them the stability they deserve. I'm so proud of you." For the first time that day, I allowed myself to smile. "Thank you, Kiss. I couldn't have done it without you." That evening, as I tucked Emily and Connor into bed, Connor asked, "Are you and Mom still mad at each other?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Sometimes grown-ups have a hard time getting along," I said gently. "But no matter what, we both love you and your sister very much." "Promise?" he asked, his voice small. "Promise," I said, pulling him into a hug. In the quiet of the house, after the kids were asleep, I sat in the living room, staring at the divorce papers on the table. It felt surreal to see everything laid out so formally: the end of a marriage, the division of assets, the fight for custody. It was the final chapter of a life I thought I'd built with someone I could trust. But as I sat there, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on me, I realized something. This wasn't just an ending. It was also a beginning. I picked up my phone and called the one person who had been my constant through all of this. "Hey, Kiss," I said when she answered. "Are you free tomorrow? I'd like to take you out for coffee. Maybe dinner." There was a pause, and then her warm, familiar laugh. "I'd like that, Matthew. A lot." For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt hope. Real, tangible hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was no longer walking it alone. I had my kids, my determination, and now, perhaps, the promise of something new. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about rebuilding. And for the first time, I believed I could.